Okay, good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is a decision to take items 4, 6 and 7 in private. Are the committee agreed to do so? No dissent. Okay. Our second item of business is consideration of a legislative consent memorandum on the Employment Rights Bill. I'm pleased to welcome our panel today: Ivan McKee, Minister for Public Finance; Stephen Garland, Unit Head, Fair Work Division; Megan Lawson, who's a lawyer with the Scottish Government; and Joe Mitchell, Procurement Policy Manager of the Scottish Government. Can I invite the Minister to make a brief statement on the Scottish Government's position? Minister.
Okay. Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Committee, and thanks for inviting me along to give evidence today. The Scottish Government remains clear that devolving employment law and industrial relations is the best way to protect workers' rights in Scotland. But while these remain reserved to the UK Parliament, the Scottish Government will, as it always has, seek to drive up fair work standards through all available mechanisms, including public procurement. For example, in 2015, we introduced statutory guidance under the Procurement Reform Scotland Act 2014 on the selection of tenderers and award of contracts to provide guidance to public bodies on how to evaluate fair work practices, including the real living wage through procurement. In October 2021, we announced a new policy of mandating payment of at least the real living wage to workers involved in Scottish Government contracts, and have encouraged other public bodies in Scotland to follow suit. Our commitment to driving fair work through procurement has been reinforced by a range of guidance, including interactive e-learning that we published in December of last year. Public bodies across Scotland are applying fair work in contracts, and the annual report on procurement activity for 21-22 reports that across 95 public bodies, a combined total of more than 2,000 suppliers committed to paying at least the real living wage and delivering regulated contracts. The Scottish Government's ability to act in this area is constrained by the devolution settlement. However, the Employment Rights Bill now confers some limited powers on the Scottish ministers, and it is for these reasons an LCM is required. For these provisions, we look forward to working closely with the UK Government to build on our fair work principles and help maximise the positive impact of the Employment Rights Bill across Scotland. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. I'm happy to open up to questions from members. Lorna Slater.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've got two questions. The first one is a little bit sort of technical, and really for my understanding, one of the provisions of the bill is around the protection from harassment, expanding employers' duties to prevent harassment of staff. I'd like to understand a bit more about what those duties are, specifically. For example, in respect to ourselves as employers and our staff being exposed to social media. So, for example, my staff look after my social media. That exposes them to some unpleasantness in that spaces. It would be interesting to understand what duties this confers on us as employers to protect our staff in these situations.
I will defer to officials on that one, because you're right, it's quite technical. Stephen, are you able to give an info?
Thanks. This is a clause that kind of sits outside Mr McKee's remit. In terms of the kind of further provisions, a lot of the detail we're expecting to come through in secondary legislation, and it will be subject to consultation. So, and we don't yet have timings for those, but that's an opportunity for all Scottish stakeholders to be able to contribute into that process. If there's any further detail on that, I can come back to you on that.
Thank you. That would be much appreciated. My other question is just a more general one for the Minister, which is the Minister content that in matters covering devolved areas, this legislation does not impinge on Scotland's ability to diverge on policies?
I don't believe so. I think we've still got to see, well, clearly there's be a lot of secondary legislation coming forward in the UK context. I think it puts us in the position where we are able to, by way of the regulations and the code, be able to put in place in the devolved procurement space measures that are at least as comprehensive as what they would intend to put in place at a UK level. But I don't think it constrains us in any way from doing anything. No.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Well, Minister, obviously since the LCM was lodged, amendments have been made to the bill in the UK Parliament, and the Scottish Government intends therefore to lodge a supplementary LCM. Could you give us an update on the amendments, and in particular, is there anything from the amendments or discussions you've had with your UK counterparts that might suggest that the supplementary LCM may not recommend consent?
Not that I'm aware of. I think we're comfortable that this confers powers on Scottish ministers, but I don't know if there's any further you want to comment. I don't know.
No, not aware of any further changes that would affect this LCM.
Okay. And do you have, I suppose, an idea on when the expected supplementary LCM might be lodged by the government at all?
In terms of kind of further one, that should be lodged fairly soon. We understand that's under active consideration in terms of being put forward to the Parliament as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Do members have any more questions? Oh, sorry, Kevin, yeah.
Convener, please. Good morning, Minister. In terms of your discussions with the UK Government around about the Employment Rights Bill, has the Government taken the opportunity to reinforce its wish that all employment law is devolved to this Parliament?
We take every opportunity, including this morning, and in our engagement with UK Government, to reinforce our position. That, as I said in my opening statement, the best way to protect workers' rights in Scotland is for the devolvement of employment law and industrial relations to the Scottish Parliament.
And has there been any movement at all from this new UK Government in that regard to allow for the devolution of employment law?
Not that I've seen so far. Other colleagues are obviously also engaging, because my specific remit is concerning procurement specifically, but to the best of my knowledge, we've not seen any movement on that to date. But we are forever hopeful, as you know.
I'm sure you'll keep trying. Thank you, Convener.
Any other questions from members? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the Minister and the panel for joining us today. That brings this evidence session on this LCM to a close, so I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item of business is our final evidence session on the Scottish Government's New Deal for Business. I'm pleased to welcome our panel this morning: Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Economy and Gaelic; Judith Young, Deputy Director of Strategic Economic and Business Engagement Division with the Scottish Government; and Dr Poonam Malik. Dr Malik and the Deputy First Minister are co-chairs of the New Deal for Business group. As always, I appeal to members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as concise as possible, and can invite the Deputy First Minister to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to committee for the opportunity to discuss the New Deal for Business programme. Thriving businesses are key to Scotland's prosperity, and their success is critical to delivering the Government's objectives. We are an unashamedly pro-growth administration committed to working with business, and over the last 24 months, the New Deal for Business programme, designed to enhance the relationship between business and government, has been front and centre of our approach, and I'm proud of what has been collectively achieved. Before I go any further, I want to put on the record my huge and sincere thanks to Poonam for her role as co-chair of the New Deal for Business group, and for all her commitment in terms of time and thoughts to co-chairing that business group. I know how much parliamentarians value the input of business leaders, and I think we do owe Poonam and many others like her a great debt of gratitude. So I hope that doesn't embarrass you too much whilst on camera. We've built good, strong relationships between business and government over the last few years, which recognise that government actions and policies exist for a reason, but that those actions also impact on business, and we need to understand the impacts of government choices on business and then work in partnership with them to minimise or mitigate those impacts. And the New Deal for Business programme was designed to kick-start systemic change. And although it was time limited, we always accepted that fully realising the change we all want to see would take longer. Delivering the New Deal for Business implementation plan, our roadmap for the past 18 months, has fundamentally altered how the government engages with business for better. And I'm pleased that we've seen real change to the culture of government, improved relationships with the business community, new tools and processes that support evidence-based policy development and better outcomes for all, and genuine enthusiasm and a new willingness to work together. And I was really heartened to hear a clear acknowledgement in earlier evidence sessions that the desired change in culture across the Scottish Government is already happening. So I'm delighted by those tangible improvements, which will be set out in more detail in the final report of the New Deal for Business, which is to be published next month. I am not, however, complacent. This is just the start, and I look forward to continuing to improve how we work with business and build on the momentum, and we'll do that through the means that we have available to us. Inevitably, I know there will always be things on which business and government don't agree, just as there are differing views within the business community. But we do see the successful conclusion of the New Deal for Business programme as an opportunity to double down even more strongly on how we work hand in glove with business. And together we can deliver successful outcomes, minimise adverse impacts, and maximise the opportunities for businesses to contribute to creating a fair, green and growing economy as a new normal. And Convener, I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Deputy First Minister. I'll therefore kick off with the first question. Why, Cabinet Secretary, was the New Deal for Business needed? What was the failures in the relationship with business that you wanted to fix?
Thanks. So the New Deal for Business was established to deliver more effective engagement with business on policy objectives. So, having been the Economy Secretary through part of COVID, I was very conscious that there was a risk that the relationship with business was very tense, in that businesses had been, in many cases, shut down for months on end. They had seen their sales fall off a cliff. Some business owners had not taken wages for almost 2 years. And there was a constant questioning and querying of why government was taking the decisions that it took. Coming off the back of that, we then entered into a cost of living crisis where, again, business was looking at spiralling energy costs, looking at higher costs, and obviously consumers struggling to contribute to the same volume of sales. And so I think the relationship between business and government was particularly strained. Then business were seeing government introduce different policies, they were introducing different legislation and asking where they featured in those conversations, in those consultations. So the point of the New Deal for Business was to reset that relationship, to ensure that there was systemic change internally within government to take into account the impact on business, and then to ensure that implementation was through partnership, was through business and government working collaboratively and collectively. So that was the issue that it was seeking to resolve, and you'll see in terms of the overarching outcomes how that work was captured. And I'm happy to go into any more detail in any of this. And convener, I'm assuming that if anybody else wants to come in on the panel, they'll either indicate or you can bring them in.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask the same question, I suppose, to Dr Malik, what your view was on that relationship before the New Deal for Business was established.
Thank you, convener, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to come here. As Cabinet Secretary have said, so the business industry, government, public sector and the citizens are important pillars who need to be coherent for a growing economy and for the society to work smoothly. As Scotland, I think we would all want that our economy is growing and thriving. The relationship between them may not always be that they need to engage and agree on each decision, but it has to be that the communication is clear and there is a trust and openness. So the realization of that, the conditions that Cabinet Secretary has outlined, they were there. But despite that, the businesses expect that there is an engagement and there is an open and transparent relationship. The outcomes may be different because government has to take into much wider context, whereas the businesses have to create new jobs, they are paying taxes, and they pay their employees to be the good citizens. What was happening in between period over the last number of years is that the two pillars of the society were working almost parallelly was the feeling among the communities. And hence this realization, which is the first step to work towards anything, to see realization that the relationship is tense, was a good start. And as a result, to do something about it and to set up this group, I think it was one of the welcome change that was welcomed by the business community. And as a result of that, we were there to recommend and implement its action to see that there is a change in there. And I think we'll probably go into the much more details about that.
Just on that issue for both yourself, Dr Malik, and for the Deputy First Minister, what you've talked about processes and the need to change processes, but what are the tangible business-related outcomes, not necessarily processes, but business-related outcomes that have come from this New Deal, which significantly changed as a result of it?
It's a great question because we are talking about a cultural change, and sometimes that can be difficult to pin down. But I have very specific examples of how that has changed. So earlier, more effective engagement with business on policy objectives, bringing them in at an earlier point in discussions. I think you had one evidence session that indicated how that had changed, for example, in last year's programme for government and in the budget, where they felt consulted at a much earlier stage and then could see tangible evidence of asks reflected back in the budget and programme for government. Secondly, there were specific subgroups. So there was the specific non-domestic rates subgroup that was brought in at critical points in the parliamentary calendar, so that we had an opportunity to hear back from them. The regulatory review group provided specific advice to ministers and officials on a number of different matters: heat and buildings, minimum unit pricing, single-use cups, non-surgical cosmetic legislation. There was a refreshed business and regulatory impact assessment and guidance co-produced. Those are just a list of different systemic ways, process ways in which there has been change, but But ultimately, the test is whether there's a culture change across government rather than different parts of government working in silos. Because if I could just add, I think the Economy Directorate has always understood that the business community, and it's not homogenous, but the business community is a key stakeholder. If you're working in health policy or you're working in environmental policy, you have a lot of stakeholders to take into account, and business may not be your first consideration. And what we've done through the New Deal for Business is change things so that there's a means of bringing in those stakeholders at an earlier point. So, for example, one of the first groups I chaired when I came back into government last summer was a group hearing from public health experts on improving health outcomes with a group with the New Deal for Business. Now, I can't recall that happening previously, but it was to break down silos. So there are some tangible examples of how process has changed to deliver a cultural outcome.
I suppose the challenge, and one of the witnesses that gave evidence, was how do you measure that? That is, these are not specific policy changes you made. You argue you've changed culture, you've changed processes, but it's those deliverable outcomes. I'm going to bring in just on one point that you did say is a published report. Did you say was coming out on the work of the New Deal?
Yes.
For business, yeah, and that so that'll set out.
That'll
set out some, yeah, that'd be helpful just to get that. Just will that set out? I suppose those measurable outcomes as a result of that.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to come in on that, Convener, and good morning, everybody. So we will be producing the final report of the New Deal for Business that will be published towards the end of April, and it's just going through its final iterations with the group at this point in time. Obviously, it's very much a report that is co-owned by all members of the group. It will cover the actions that have been taken in response to the 6 overarching outcomes that we have for New Deal for Business, and it will talk about the various metrics that we have established that are designed to begin to capture some of the change that we have. We did have a specific subgroup that looked at business metrics, what metrics were available, how we published those, and how we would continue to do that going forward. So we have begun to measure new things around business sentiment and views on Scottish Government and government policy and alignment in a way that we were not doing prior to the New Deal for Business. It's not perfect because what we're trying to measure here is something that is relatively intangible, but we have a benchmark from which we can move forward in terms of measurement.
Okay, I don't know if you want to come in, Dr. Malik. Sorry.
I think I would say that when we set out to work with the group, for the first 1.5 months, we did a sprint, and since then I always say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, as we say, for the cultural change. We did keep the parameters and focus narrow on cultural change and policy cycle and the regulation aspects that affect the businesses. We already had a national strategy for economic transformation. There are enough measures and matrices in it. So as a part of that, we didn't want to specifically did not create any more specific outcomes and measures, because what we will change as part of the group's actions and working together, business and government, is to lead to increasing in that. And if it is Judith's point of view, if I will say sentiment were to be measured, so and if you were to believe, you have the evidence from Diffley Partnership in terms of the survey that was carried out. So if I were to give the example, in June or September 2023, the 550 businesses that were surveyed to say, does Scottish Government care or understand for the businesses? The ratings were 32%, and in December 2024, the same survey for the 655 businesses says it's 48%. So there is clearly improvement. Similarly, during the same period, there was another measure asked for the same businesses, because this is tangible in terms of numbers we are asking, is to say, are there measures that have been put in place in that period? Again, in September 2024, this was 27% that approved that. whereas in December 24, I think 42% businesses agreed that in that period, tangible measures have been taken and the business sentiments is improved. So those are the things which we can say how business is feeling sentiment, but specific measures in terms of growing economy, investment, jobs created, those measures are measured wider part of it, and that wasn't what we set out to measure in the New Deal for Business Group.
Okay, that's very helpful, Dr. Lara. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Kevin Stewart and then the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I want to tease out a little bit more around about your comments and cross-government working. And you mentioned public health and the economy. I want to look at pharmacies. I visited one of the pharmacies in my constituency just a couple of weeks ago. Discussion, of course, was around about the health issues and the way that pharmacies have been delivering more and more services. Obviously, that conversation got into non-domestic rates, the hike in employers' national insurance, which obviously is an issue that's reserved to Westminster. But sometimes it seems that there are not that linkages between the likes of the health portfolio and the economy portfolio, and changes, little changes in terms of policy can often make a huge difference in terms of how a pharmacy can operate, how it can keep its head above water. Can I ask you, Deputy First Minister and Dr Malik as well, do you think that others in other portfolios, when they are making policy decisions, are actually thinking about the impact on the economy as well as whatever policy area that portfolio covers, in this instance health?
Well, I think they are to a greater extent as a result of New Deal for Business than perhaps was the case previously. And your examples there are about implementation of laudable policy. So where a policy originates, often in Parliament, often not exclusively by government, where there's general consensus, for example, in Parliament, our responsibility, I believe, irrespective of where we are in government, is to bring into the conversation at an early stage those that are going to be most impacted. And then secondly, considering implementation of that laudable policy. So I gave you a list just there of different matters that the Regulatory Review Group have been looking at. And actually, you could argue that none of those, well, none of them do sit explicitly in the economy space. So non-surgical cosmetic legislation, heat in buildings, single-use cups. These are all areas, but those that are on the front line of implementation are largely in the business community. And if they are going to be, like your pharmacy example, they are going to be having to change their approach or their practices or trying to mitigate some of the impact, then they need to be brought into the conversation at a much earlier stage. And that is what we have trialled with the New Deal for Business, like the example around public health inequalities. If you look at some of the policy suggestions around health outcomes, around alcohol, sugary, high-fat foods and so on, rather than talking to business at the end of the process, bring them in at the beginning to understand how a very laudable policy aim can be implemented by those who are ultimately going to be tasked with the implementation. And your pharmacy's example is an absolutely brilliant, example, because they are ultimately on the front line. That is the point at which a citizen interacts with a policy change. And so if they are not brought in at the beginning and are just left to implement at the end, then I don't think it leads to the best outcomes. And that is what the New Deal for Business has tried to change, and I think successfully tried to change.
Dr Malik, please.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And health being my area, I'm particularly close to this sector. If I were to look at the 2 years of the New Deal for Business Group, one of the things that may be unsettling for business sometimes is that in that we've had 3 cabinet secretary changes. I would say from the business side and along with the government officials, we've provided the stability. But the advantage of that has been that all 3 cabinet secretaries are now in new investment and economic growth subcommittee. As a result, they have a better idea of what the New Deal for Business principles are, how their particular portfolio may be impacting the business, or how the business's insights may be important to understand and bring any changes. What businesses don't like is surprises. And in that case, as you said, economic conditions are tough. NI contributions, we don't have control over it at the moment, or there are changes in terms of the NDR and other expectations, and business is difficult for any operational costs are so high. Every business has to manage, and pharmacies are independent organizations that are being supporting. But in that case, in that policy cycle, for example, regulatory review group, if there is a change in policy coming through, rather than landing on the businesses suddenly, I think as part of that revival, anything that the government officials are considering or government parliament is considering, that should be discussed and introduced as that. And as an example of that, even at the last New Deal for Business Group in December, we did discuss health and care policy. The colleagues from the Directorate came, spoke to business leaders who can provide insights into that. And similarly, the cross-directorate and cross-portfolio region policies are expected. I don't want to use word hope because hope is not action. What we are looking for is that action in there, that will be embedded into each policy-making government, and the government officials have created that new policy cycle.
So obviously, that employers' national insurance hike was one of the top things in the agenda in Mickey's Pharmacy. I'm not going to go there today because we all know how damaging that is. But I want to look at some of these other issues, which sometimes are not the fault of government per se, but we haven't set parameters well enough for others in terms of dealing with business. So, you know, one of the things which gets a lot of business folk down is bureaucracy, and it seems that bureaucracies grow to a greater degree in certain parts of the country by certain public bodies than others. So let's stick with the pharmacy scenario, where often, and Dr Malik may be more aware of this than me and others, often data sharing is a problem. If somebody is coming into a pharmacy for treatment to save them going to their GP, data sharing can often be a problem, particularly in some parts of the country, but not in others. How can we cut down on those bureaucracies, particularly the ones that are built up by other public bodies who seem to apply their own rules? And how do we get this right for everyone and save business a huge amount of difficulties? Maybe DFM first and then Dr Malik, please.
Yeah, so I think the point you're making is one that is very close to my heart, which is how do we ensure that any of the systemic changes, cultural changes that have happened within government don't remain within government? Because actually, when it comes to all the various public sector arms, they too need to appreciate and recognise what we've tried to achieve through the New Deal for Business. And there needs to be an understanding that all parts of the public sector are also in the business of economic development. So when last summer I came back in, realising that if you take a completely different sector, let's take the energy transition, which I know is another area that is close to Mr Stewart's heart. But there's a lot of public bodies that may not see themselves as part of energy transition, but could make or break that.
Yep.
So, Marine Scotland, key. Crown Estate, key.
Yep.
Various different local authorities that have responsibility over planning, key. SEPA, key. Nature Scot, so on and so forth. And that could also be applied to your pharmacy point, that those organisations, those public sector bodies, have absolutely got a duty to protect data as according to the law, protect citizens, patients, but at the same time to ensure that organisations, bodies can operate as efficiently and effectively as possible. And the nature of pharmacies is a really good example because they are semi-autonomous. You know, they are in many cases independent. If you were to introduce regulation, bureaucracy that meant they all had to shut down, then that would be a poor service to the patient at the end of the day. So it's finding that fine line of laudable policy that is then implemented in a way that doesn't completely inhibit an autonomous, independent organisation like a pharmacy from working. And I think that's where we're trying to create that culture change, because often it is the implementation rather than the core policy itself. So we all know what the various regulations and legislation that underpins data sharing. But actually, there's a lot of freedom there too, to put the patient at the heart and to create systems that operate around the patient and enable greater data sharing. So there's separate work going on in government. Neil Gray and I have co-chaired a number of groups with economy and health there as co-chairs to try and lead to some of that culture change. But I'm not going to pretend it isn't a work in process.
Thank you. Dr. Malik, do you have anything to add, please?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary is absolutely right that economy is not just one directorate's job. Economy is every portfolio, every parliamentarian's work, because eventually if we don't have a growing economy, we don't have a country that is thriving, and we cannot create jobs and we cannot bring tax back to spend on public services. But for the citizen's point of view, if I were to say health is wealth, because if a person is not healthy, we'll be spending more in in treating and reacting rather than preventative. So in that case, having a good electronic connected record system for the patients, for the citizens, would be an idealistic scenario, the best version that we can have. Naturally, that will require consent, awareness with the public, and engagement with the businesses to see, because they are semi-autonomous and independent. But if it is saving ultimately money for them, they can run an effective businesses. Most business leaders will choose to do that. Similarly, patients and citizens may be worried about their data safety, but if it is handled properly and it is foolproof, most patients will agree to share because they don't need to travel millions of miles. They can probably get their data and get a supply of their medication close by, which is connected to their general practitioners and pharmacy. And eventually, it's not something that cannot be done. There are countries in the world who are moving towards that, and they are linked services. So we ought to be working towards that, and it will require resources and it will require work to do that. That's in the interest of nation and people. So you're absolutely right that we need to have it linked. We need to have better system. We just need to work towards that, to agree with the patients, with the businesses, and the resources to provide. And naturally, funding, it all requires funding as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
I thought that was going to be a quick supplementary from Kevin Stewart, because I was going to bring in, on the back of my question, because I was going to bring in Murdo Fraser, who was going to follow on specifically with my questions around tangible delivery. So I'll bring in Murdo Fraser and then I'll come back to the Deputy Convener. Is that okay? Because unless yours is A supplementary on the...
It's a supplementary
Okay,
on the opening statement of the Deputy First Minister.
I'll let the Deputy Convener in first.
Thank you, Mr Fraser, as well, for indulging me. I'm very heartened to hear what you have to say, Deputy First Minister, about a change in culture and the use of the term, or rather, I think it's a bold statement you make, because culture is extraordinarily difficult to change and takes intensive effort on a sustained basis. And we've already touched on silos, which I think would be the obvious one. How do we overcome that? And we've had some evidence about that. But how is it, or what is it you plan, given your limited capacity? You've got a huge remit to ensure that the focus is sustained and cascaded through the depths of government, and what measures have been put in place to ensure that economic growth and all that it enables stays at the top of the agenda?
Yeah, and that is why I said this is just the start, because I totally recognise your point here about the bold statement of culture change, and why I probably didn't say it in my opening remarks that it's job done tick, because
we wouldn't have believed you.
Yes, and you believe everything else I say. So it's a process. It's an ongoing process. So in terms of the change, what the New Deal for Business has done is, first of all, make sure that the processes which take into account the impact on the economy. So, whether it's through the Regulatory Review Group, whether it is through the refreshed business impact assessments, there is a test there that officials need to answer before they introduce anything. So there's that process point. The second thing is to get people thinking in a different way about implementation. And the way that we are doing that currently, or the way that I've introduced that we do that, is with this Cabinet subgroup. So a part of Cabinet that is focused on economy and investment. And it goes to the point that I shared with Kevin Stewart about everybody is involved in the job of investment and attracting investment, or actually pushing investment away. And we've had some very useful conversations in that group. It's quite free-flowing amongst Cabinet secretaries, thinking through what impact their decisions on transport has on investment in the economy, housing, social justice, health. And there's a forum there, starting at the top, of actually taking into account not just whether that decision is right or wrong to make, but what impact it has on the economy and investment. So my hope is that then that filters down from those Cabinet level conversations. But the third thing is then the test of whether this is having an impact. And I guess I hear that feedback pretty quick. So if businesses are up in arms about something, if Kevin's pharmacy is unhappy with something, that gets back to me pretty quick, and you realise that it hasn't worked in the way that it should have. There is a caveat to that, which is that not all stakeholders will always agree with what government does, irrespective of how government does it. There are some things where you have to make binary choices about proceeding with a policy that may not be completely popular amongst one demographic, and that will always be a challenge. I think the key there is to have no surprises, to explain the decision that we've taken, and to look at any ways of mitigating that. And that was certainly the case in the budget, where there were some areas of the budget that were very positively received. There were some parts of the budget that were less positively received. But there was a reason behind those decisions, for example, additional resources for something. So I think that That is the approach, but these will all. This is not. It's not simple. It's not straightforward, and government is engaged in the business of trying to achieve multiple objectives. And sometimes we just need to be honest and own up to the fact that sometimes those objectives come into conflict with another objective, and you have to come down on one side or the other.
And I think we understand that. Just following off the point about cascading within the organisation that is government, that is siloed, that is complex, that's ever shifting. Beyond the kind of process elements that you outline, such as BRIAs, to what extent will DGs, and therefore embedding that leadership and that depth of leadership, be rewarded, measured and rewarded or otherwise, based on not just following process, but actually continuing to drive the cultural shift down through their direct reports?
Yes, and this is critical. This is probably the biggest question in terms of culture change, because Cabinet Secretaries can, be on board and can see the opportunity here. But ultimately, they are partly dependent on the advice that they receive, and advice about process, implementation, who's saying what, who's happy with this, who's not happy with this. And that engagement needs to happen at that level too. So talking about officials, I'll ask an official.
Thank you very much, DFM. So in terms of the role that DGs and the executive team have had in this, we've had a couple of sessions at executive team where there have been detailed consideration of the New Deal for Business and what that actually means across the piece for different Directors General. So we did some work ahead of PFG, so kind of August 2024, where we looked across the piece and mapped all the policy interventions that were coming down the line through PFG. And we looked across the piece there from a kind of helicopter view to create a matrix of those things. And we brought that to the table so that there could be a full understanding of, if you're doing something over here, what's the impact of that on something over there? And how can we actually align and ensure that the decisions that we're making, we're not doing something, the left hand isn't doing something that doesn't line up with what the right hand is doing. So I think there's a really good understanding of the importance of New Deal for Business, cascading through the organisation. The way that we're viewing it is we're working from the bottom up and from the top down. Most practical example, the officials within my division are regularly contacted now by officials from other policy areas in other DGs asking for advice on, okay, I need to take this policy intervention. How do I engage with business? When do I engage with business? Can you help me with that? And we have a supporting role in that, and we will continue to deliver that as we come out of the New Deal for Business delivery phase, the implementation phase, and we move into, just mainstreaming this work as the work of the Business Relationships Division to support other parts of government.
Okay, and just a quick follow-on, and I do want to hear from Dr Malik as well. One of the good bits about Scotland is everybody knows everybody. One of the sometimes downside is everybody knows everybody. In other words, how from a business context can we avoid groupthink and always keeping the perspective fresh, particularly the significant drivers for change. We had a witness at one of our sessions, Tony Rogers from MTEL UK Limited, who would have said that I think all the committee felt that it was an entirely refreshing approach, and it felt to us that often government will go to the same old, not because they're not good, and I'm not dismissing anybody, but because it's easier, because it's actually quite hard work to find those voices with a fresh perspective. Often those voices are the ones taking the risk, and often they're quite small. They could be spin-outs from university. So in terms of that cultural shift, because we need to be at the kind of head of the queue with some of the drivers, how are you going to, or what are your plans within this cultural shift to embed that sort of fresh perspective within government? And then I will bring in yourself, Dr Malik.
So that is the kind of question that I am constantly asking, because I will often hear it said that the business community thinks X, Y or Z, and it completely fails to recognise that there is as much disagreement amongst our wonderful businesses on particular different things. Some can benefit from a particular policy change, some may not, in terms of these sort of subject area policies. So getting the fresh perspective really matters, and often there will be some trade associations, trade organisations that will speak on behalf of a group of businesses, and even they recognise that amongst, for example, the FSB, there will be just the nature of representing lots of small businesses in different sectors will mean there are different views on different things in that. So bringing the fresh perspective in is important. That's why I don't believe in continuing with particular groups indefinitely, because you do want to bring in perspective. And that's why I also strongly believe in engaging with businesses on a one-to-one basis. During COVID, I remember inviting officials to engage with particular businesses that had approached me that bucked the trend, that were saying a different thing, that wasn't part of the norm. We were hearing particular messages, and then you'd engage with a number of small different businesses that were saying something totally different, and engaging with them on a one-to-one basis, rather than always just viewing it as a group. So in terms of Tony Rogers, if I've remembered his name, I am aware that many said it was a fresh perspective. I'm very happy to engage with him and others like him on their solutions and suggestions.
Yeah. And just finishing off with yourself, Dr. Malik, what do you see as your role going forward? And it may not be you personally, but I think it's generally recognised what you've been able to bring to and very much valued. What do you see, how that's going to work for this freshness of perspective and the sound voice going forward to keep focusing on this shift in culture?
Thank you. That's a key question which you have brought about, because 23 months ago, next month will be 24th anniversary of the New Deal for Business, 2 years, is when we brought about, the word new was there, but there is a deal for business that needs to do and needs to go up forever, because as we said, that these are the two pillars for the society, for the economic growth, and we cannot let one drop over the other. So as a result of that, I welcome, and then Scotland's made up of 99.3% of SMEs. There are 0.7% of large businesses only, which bring in about 59% of the turnover. So the question is, there has to be a mechanism to engage with them, but then the reality is that as part of the New Deal for Business, we could not have engaged with 99.3% of businesses around the table. That would have become unwieldy. So in that case, we did include 1 or 2, 3 small businesses. The challenge with that is because they are fighting, firefighting every day, the reality becomes they have to take care of their business rather than coming to the committee meetings and contributing to that. And that's why some of the people you heard from that the businesses dropped out. And that simply was the reason. They just said that running the business was proving too difficult. In terms of larger businesses, they do have resources to put delegation in. So yes, there has to be means and ways to engage with businesses. And as part of that, sort of Judith outlined that there was engagement done as part of the government. I myself attended in the Service of Nations for both years to work. I met DGs to work and discuss the importance of that. And Cabinet Secretary engaged that the policy cycle and New Deal principles have been shared. On the business front, that was a part of the other initiative which we needed to take out, because what happened when we were setting out the membership of this, I recognized this, that the trade organizations come to front and say we represent X number of businesses, hence we are the prime candidate for that. But we also want to hear, you're absolutely right, directly from businesses, and that's key, which is where that, because one of the things, and you also heard some people said that New Deal for Businesses diluted the relationship or engagement with the existing businesses or the 4, 5, 6 group that is there. The reality is that in that case, you're hearing directly or from the members who are representative rather than the direct businesses. The beauty of the New Deal for Business was that if anyone who's understood the economic there is an opportunity cost of it. So if members or leaders, business leaders are coming around the table, they have to agree and hold each other's feet to fire. If I am dropping this initiative, I have to take up something else. There is a cost to it. So not everybody can fight for their portfolio or their sector. And that's what happens when people lobby for their individual sector or individual trade organization, which is why a strategic forum, which sits above the trade bodies, above the membership organization, is key, because then you are not getting lobbied by a particular force, whoever is able to confront. You have to agree in a common forum to say we are agreeing to take this initiative forward, whereas something else needs to be dropped off, and that's the by here. So I think in future there has to be ways to engage with direct businesses, but there is a value in having that insight, fresh perspective, as you mentioned, spin-outs and investments into the SMEs which are there, and by a diverse variety of businesses.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Convener.
Very much. Before we were interrupted, Murdo Fraser.
Convener, to get to my questions. Thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Good morning. Nice to see Dr. Malik. Dr. Malik and I shared a very interesting visit to SIDE in Perth for Skills Apprenticeship Week. Might come back to that in a minute. Just to pick up a point you made, Cabinet Secretary, in your opening remarks, you talked about how the government had built good, strong relationships with business. The Deputy Convener referenced the evidence we got from Tony Rogers from MTEL UK Limited, MTEL Scotland headquartered manufacturing company with operations internationally employing hundreds of people. What he said to us, I'll just quote this from the official report. He said, "I have no interaction with the Scottish Government whatsoever. I had never heard of this new deal and had no idea about it. Quite frankly, when I have approached the Scottish Government, it has been very difficult as a business person in Scotland to make any sort of contact or inroads or to make any kind of representation of a case." That's just a direct quote from what he told us. So does that suggest that there's still an issue? I mean, this is the sort of business you would have thought in the tech sector, high growth sector, that should be precisely at the heart of what the government's trying to do. And yet, Mr. Rogers told us he's never even heard of the new deal.
Yeah, and yet he's doing very well by the sounds of it. So I think there's a balance here, which is to say that government should not and need not be deep in the weeds of every single business. As Dr. Malik said, there are a lot of businesses out there. There are thousands of businesses out there. Many of them are doing extremely well. Often when they get in touch, it's often to acknowledge something that isn't going well. So where businesses are prospering, they are succeeding, they are recruiting, they are employing, and they are contributing to economic growth, then actually the less involvement they have with government, perhaps the better for them. The second point I would make, however, is that we are in a different, if I'm wearing a different hat, taking a different approach to inward investment and a different approach to high growth businesses. So there are three things that we are changing and have changed in the last few months. The first is our approach to investor relations, so taking a far more professional approach to investor relations. So rather than waiting for a business to approach us as and when they need government support or government intervention, taking a far more strategic and targeted approach to that relationship. And I can share a little bit more if it's of interest how we're doing that, and that's with my sort of investment hat on. The second is to be really clear about where the biggest opportunities for growth are in Scotland, where investment is required, and having a clearer sense of that. So until recently, we didn't have a pipeline of all the private sector-led and the public sector-led highest growth opportunities. In many cases, because private sector just deals with that itself in terms of seeking investment and so on. So there has been a shift on the investment side of things, but I imagine that quote could be replicated for a number of other businesses who frankly are running their business and not necessarily reading up on every government report that is published, probably for good reason.
Okay, but Mr. Rogers, to be fair, did say to us he would have welcomed engagement. Okay. So have you reached out to him?
I haven't reached out to him, but I will happily reach out to him.
Okay. Thank you. And just on that, the Fraser Allender Institute published a Scottish Business Monitor every year. The most recent report came in October. That report told us that 9% of those who responded agreed the Scottish Government understands the business environment, 62% disagreed. And the same survey said that the percentage of businesses who believe the Scottish Government engages effectively is just 6%. 6%, that was in October 24. That was actually down from 8% the previous year, as a net figure of minus 62%. So it does suggest that there's a gap there in terms of people who believe government is engaging properly with business.
And yet the Diffley Partnership Understanding Business Survey showed around 48% of 600 businesses surveyed said that they believe the Scottish Government does understand their concerns. So I take what Fraser of Allender reports as a reason to double down, work harder, be as open, as engaging as possible. But I also take into account the Diffley Partnership work and the improvement that Dr Malik outlined a moment ago in that. So we, I think, will keep focusing on the feedback we get in all different forms, because I can assure anybody listening that we are nothing but accessible. I am accessible on a Friday morning in my constituency with a surgery and businesses dropping in, and we are accessible in terms of the diary of engaging extensively across different sectors. So we are listening. I think that what business often defines as effective engagement is not just the listening and the accessibility, it's that they then see their asks reflected back in policy. And I was very encouraged by the feedback to the Programme for Government and to the budget, knowing that we didn't deliver everything that business wanted, and we were open about that. But you did see some very positive commentary, particularly Scottish Retail Consortium in relation to the Programme for Government, in acknowledging they actually just don't want surprises. And there were no surprises. And there was a number of initiatives there that actually don't sit in the Economy Directorate, but which were music to their ears.
Thank you. Leads me neatly on to my next question, which is to ask about specific outputs.
Yeah.
Now, we took evidence from Leon Thompson from UK Hospitality. What he said to us was this: direct access to an engagement with ministers and cabinet secretaries has never really been the issue. The bit that has not always been there has been the government's understanding of the need to act in a way that supports our businesses. What we should be taking from the experience of the past 2 years and the New Deal is the need for all our ministers and cabinet secretaries to be focused on economic growth and have a clear understanding of how that fits with their portfolio responsibilities, so that everybody is moving in the same direction. Now, I'm sure you would agree with that, but that's what he told us just a few weeks ago. It suggests he doesn't think that's happening.
Can you remember who said that? Sorry,
Leon Thompson from UK Hospitality.
Yeah. And you know, I've spoken to Leon Thompson a number of times. I understand particularly the frustrations in and around hospitality and tourism. It has been a pretty tough period of time. I certainly, from if you use him as an example, my diary and Richard Lochhead's diary will confirm that there is extensive engagement with that sector. The question is whether we can do more to relieve some of the pressures on that sector. I imagine if you drill down on what some of the pressures are right now, hike in energy costs, massive hike in energy costs. They will be feeling the pressures of ENICs going up. There will be a number of other points that they will wish to make. I think that we do what we can to relieve some of those pressures. We certainly understand and engage extensively with them on what their issues are. And then in the round, government has to make choices about how to deploy resources as effectively as possible. And that's where, you know, I have a more balanced approach, where being open and transparent about the ways in which we can meet some of those asks that they have, And there are other cases where we may not be able to meet those asks, which is the case for every government. And yes, it is the government's focus on economic growth. We also have focus on getting to net zero, resilient public services, and on child poverty. And we need to balance all of those objectives up. And I think it would be foolhardy to say that sometimes those objectives don't come into conflict with one another.
But I asked about output. So seeing as you've taken hospitality as an example, what are the specific outputs on hospitality that the new deal for business has delivered?
Yeah. Number one, their biggest issue was regulation. So, the cumulative impact of regulation. Regulation that at times felt it was coming all at the same time. So what have we done? Regulatory Review Group. We now have a built-in process which looks at the potential regulation coming down the line and ensures that there is a means of understanding internally in government the cumulative impact of policy and regulatory decisions on businesses, which is why there was positive commentary about the programme for government and the budget, that there was no additional regulations at a time where I think one business had talked about, you know, the list of different regulation that they were all trying to implement at the same time. And generally, businesses are not anti-regulation, but when it's a cumulative impact on top of a cost of living crisis, dealing with the aftermath of COVID, that is challenging. So there's one example that allows ministers to scrutinise that cross-portfolio regulatory landscape. Judith wants to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that a specific example of the work that the Regulatory Review Group did on the minimum unit pricing. So obviously you will be aware that minimum unit pricing legislation was coming to an end, and there was a sunset clause and decisions to be made around what the future of minimum unit pricing would look like. So the policy officials that worked on that came to the Regulatory Review Group, discussed options with the Regulatory Review Group. The Regulatory Review Group made a number of recommendations, particularly around ensuring that there was an effective lead-in time for any changes and any increase in the MUP price, and also around the time of year at which the minimum unit pricing legislation should be implemented, that further increase. And they made sure that that did not happen in the peak trading period for hospitality businesses. So those recommendations of the RRG in relation to MUP were taken on board. There were changes made to when that decisions were implemented and the regulations came in, and that was received extremely positively by the hospitality sector.
But on that example, the end point was the same, in that MUP was still increased, which is not something the industry wanted.
Yeah, but this is the fundamental point. I think we deceive ourselves if we don't say that there are policies which are implemented for particular outcomes, but which are not popular in certain sectors. So I don't think any of us are saying that we expect every policy to be universally welcomed by every citizen in Scotland. That just can't be the case. But the point of the New Deal for Business is to bring business in at the beginning to ensure that implementation is as streamlined and as straightforward as possible. That is a very different approach to saying that policy is universally welcome, which when you're trying to achieve multiple different aims, as MUP is, MUP is there to reduce alcohol dependency, poor health outcomes from alcohol misuse and so on. And a business that is, I think is largely on board with those policy objectives, but we need to make sure that the implementation has their input.
Well, let me just pick one more example if I can, because Dr. Malik and I did an interesting visit I referred to during Apprenticeship Week. And as part of that visit and other visits I did and the committee did, one issue that keeps being raised with us is the apprenticeship levy. And the fact that the apprenticeship levy is paid by businesses in Scotland, but they don't seem to see the value coming back from that compared to companies operating south of the border. So is that on your agenda, Cabinet Secretary?
It is on my agenda because skills is on my agenda.
Yep.
Skills is very high up on my agenda. We obviously do take a different approach to the apprenticeship levy. I would argue that businesses do see the benefit of it. They may not, in the same way in an English context, see the input-output as a very specific equation, but clearly the funding is reinvested in apprenticeships of different types, foundation apprenticeships, graduate apprenticeships, and different skills. But where I do think we have a huge opportunity right now is to look at the whole skills landscape and understand how it is meeting our growth objectives. So we have a really good problem at the moment because we have high growth in particular sectors, massive potential growth in aerospace, massive potential growth in renewables, massive potential growth in other sectors. If I'm engaging with a developer right now, they are saying the scale of potential construction across Scotland makes them question whether they'll be able to access the skills that they need. In other words, there's such growth happening. So I do think, and Graham Day is very involved in these conversations that we're having. We've done specific things on the side, so £3.5 million for offshore wind. I just been working with advanced manufacturing, contributing specific funding for a skills effort there. So there are things that we are doing on the side of the general skills landscape. But I do know that Graham Day is keeping all of this under review, and there is a different approach to the apprenticeship levy. I would argue that the benefit is still there. It's just that a business can't say output leading to input on a very individualised basis.
Dr. Malloch, do you want to add anything?
Thank you. And it was an enjoyable visit, I would say, with my other hat on as a board member of Skills Development Scotland for last 4 years. And I know from the programme of the committee that next year are going to hear evidence from on the new regulatory bill that's coming. We are in a state of, I suppose, transition in the skills landscape. Skills, and with bringing my previous academic and research hat and the growth of the life sciences sector, health sector, as I said, skills are key. Every business that we speak to today is skills is a priority. So having that right, having a workforce that is ready for employment is key. So apprenticeships are a critical medium for that, and every business understands that, because there is no playbook for the jobs that are coming today and coming tomorrow. I wouldn't say it's even in the future, because the green jobs and the jobs of digital and data, they don't exist. So businesses do it on the go as they are training their staff. Sometimes, as we saw, they need to create their own academies because there's no other institution offering, because there was no requirement clear. The colleges can be a partner, they can plan with that, and Skills Development Scotland has been playing a critical role in that, in supporting the apprenticeships and going and working with the school children, advising them. So on the apprenticeship aspects, I would say certainly there is a need that it stays, and businesses are a key part of how that is planned and how that is used in allocation, as well as the mode for apprenticeship option remaining to them, and then they have, industry has because without that it would be lost if we don't have the voice of industry in the creation of those.
Okay, thank you.
Murdo Fraser, can I bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson?
Thanks very much. Morning to the panel. One of the areas that has been highlighted has faced real pressures recently through the pandemic, after the pandemic, but obviously going forward has been tourism. Obviously a vital area to the Highlands Islands that I represent, and the area obviously that the Deputy First Minister represents. There's been real concern over the introduction of legislation like short-term licensing and how that's been done, the implementation, and now there's the prospect of the visitor levy being introduced under consultation with a number of councils. Surely that is an example of actually where a sector like the tourism sector may well have been listened to, but what they've been saying hasn't been acted on. So
can I just say very clearly on because I'm in receipt of the same emails that I imagine Jamie Halcrow-Johnson's in receipt of, that for the tourism levy, it is entirely Highland Council's choice as to whether to introduce that or not. And I have stressed that, I've emphasised that. The enabling legislation went through the Scottish Government through extensive consultation. But Highland Council are obviously now running their own consultation, and it is critical that the voice of business is taken into account, because we all know that the value of any levy like that is on the additionality it adds to the experience for tourists. And my impression, based on the engagement that I've had with a number of businesses on a constituency level, is that most say they don't have an in-principle objection to the concept, but they want their views to be taken into account in terms of how the council manages that. And obviously, Edinburgh City Council is at a more advanced stage.
If I can just come in on that, I mean, I think there is an acceptance that the visitor levy is going to, is a thing that's likely to happen, or certainly potentially could happen. Actually, most of the concerns that have been raised with me is that initial legislation, what went through this Parliament. For example, a situation that leads to not having a flat rate but having a percentage. The fact that VAT now will be essentially charged on the fee itself. How that is collected, essentially turning businesses into tax collectors. Now that's all come from this Parliament, not Highland Council, not Argyll, Murray, wherever it's happened to be. That's come here. So do you have concerns? I mean, do you have concerns about that implementation, and how would you say the new deal for business and the group could have played a role or didn't play a role in making sure that legislation was right as it came through?
And I should have said at the beginning, I have a register of interest in terms of family members that operate a tourism business, so I'll just put that on the record. But on this point around the legislation, I don't accept that. If you look at the consultation and I can't precisely remember when, but I think I came back into government sort of halfway through the legislative process. I can't quite recall precisely. But there were, if you look at the consultation response, there were a number of different calls. So there were some that were very much in favour of a flat rate. There were some that were very strongly in favour of a percentage rate. It kind of proves the point I was sharing earlier, that the tourism industry is not homogenous. Mm-hmm. So there were some particularly small businesses that were very hostile to a flat rate, because it would have been a bigger percentage of a night stay. So the way that the legislation is designed is to try and make it as flexible as possible for councils. There are, for example, a number of exemptions that can be included. There are a number of different approaches and processes for collection. And my view is that councils are now responsible for how they conduct the consultation with Visit Scotland input, how they conduct the consultation and how they design a scheme that works for their local businesses. And whilst I'm very open to feedback from businesses on how it operates, I have to stress that it is now a council responsibility. It was councils that wanted the enabling legislation. Councils now have the enabling legislation. How they implement it matters, but it is ultimately their duty to engage with the businesses on that point. Now, there is a review point baked into the legislation, and I know it's now Ivan McKee's responsibility, and he is engaging at the moment as to whether there needs to be additional flexibility on this point around a flat rate. You will know Highland Council weren't in favour of a single flat rate either. Mm-hmm. They wanted a tiered rate. Mm-hmm. So there's complexity here on the different businesses that wanted a different approach, and the different councils that wanted a different approach. And the legislation is trying to be as broad as possible, but I would strongly encourage councils to engage well with businesses and to design a scheme that mitigates any of the concerns that are being raised. I
mean, just to be clear, I think councils perhaps wanted this because they're trying to plug gaps in their budgets because of central government squeeze. But I've not spoken to anybody who is supportive of the legislation as it's being enabled, as it's being implemented. And I'd be very interested to know how many people are writing to you saying, look, we're actually pretty happy with this. because I doubt it.
And I'm not arguing here whether or not businesses are happy with it. My point is that the legislation is enabling legislation, and there is now a duty to consult. There's a duty on councils to consult well. And I guess I get a little bit sceptical of colleagues demanding that that central government doesn't interfere with local authority decisions, but then when they're not comfortable with the way things are going with local authorities, they come back to central government to say, you must change this or you must put a stop to this.
Just to be clear then, are you happy with the legislation that came through this?
I think the legislation is very broad, and I think it allows for a number of flexibilities and exemptions that businesses are calling for, and it will be the decision of local authorities as to how they design a scheme that works. I think there's a lot of flexibility in there. I am very alive to the fact that different local authorities and different business groups asked for different things. Some asked for percentage, some asked for tiered rates, some asked for a flat rate. There was other ways, and ultimately you then need to take that into account and design a scheme that works for the most people. Ivan McKee is currently open to, and he is currently engaging with the tourism businesses on whether anything else could be done to the legislation to make it even more flexible. So there is an openness to engaging with the tourism industry right now on whether anything further could be done on the legislation. There will be a challenge if it requires primary legislation, but there is an openness there. But I go back to the consultation responses and the fact that there was a broad range of views on whether it should be a percentage or not, particularly for small businesses who felt that a flat rate would be a disproportionate percentage of their nightly rate. So that is why having as much flexibility in the enabling legislation is important. But I stress that it will be for local authorities to determine whether or not to introduce a tourism levy and to design one that takes into account the strong feedback from businesses in the Highlands. And I am very conscious that that feedback has been very strong.
Okay, thanks.
Lorna Slater.
Thank you very much, Convener. So we heard in previous evidence sessions from representatives of business and so on here that they felt that they had quite a good understanding of the duties of business to reaching net zero, to the well-being economy, to the circular economy, and of course that new kid on the block being nature positive. I'm not sure that's what I've been hearing on the ground. I'd love to hear from you guys how well you think Scottish businesses understand all their duties in all those spaces, because that's quite a lot for them to take on.
Yeah, and I'd be interested if Dr. Malik has any thoughts on this. But, I mean, by and large, my experience of Scottish business is that they want to do the right thing. They see themselves as critical to the local economy, but they are very interested in how they do their business, not just in what they are doing. And perhaps the difference is that we have a tendency in Parliament or in the public sector to use terms to define a lot of things, which actually businesses by and large want to do themselves. So if I take one example around single-use cups, I'm very conscious of a lot of coffee shops that have already made decisions to try and contribute towards environmental sustainability, irrespective of legislative changes. So I do think that irrespective of how people define the work that they do and those duties that you outlined, businesses want to do the right thing.
And I guess it's about the implementation and understanding, because as you say, we use terms like circular economy. I'm not sure the average person, knows what that means, and things like how to be nature positive and what that means for businesses. So I'm interested in understanding how much this is part of the relationship with businesses. Making sure businesses understand these concepts that we bring up in government and what that means for them on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, Judith, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that point and just draw your attention to the Wellbeing Economy subgroup of the New Deal for Business. So that was one of the 5 subgroups that was set up under the New Deal for Business, and it brought together key stakeholders with an interest in the wellbeing economy, and it's done some really positive work around exactly the point that you're talking about, producing a definition of what the wellbeing economy means for business and what the different things are that they can get engaged in to contribute towards that. So there has been work under the umbrella of New Deal for Business in this space. I mean, no doubt that there is more that can be done, and that really will fall on the individual policy leads and ministers that are leading on those particular policy changes. But we have provided this umbrella under that wellbeing economy subgroup, which we expect will continue to take that work forward, albeit in a different form when New Deal comes to a close.
Thank you. My other question is somewhat related to that. So we've also taken evidence from representatives of cooperative social enterprises and other democratic business models, so alternative business models. And they felt that they were not part of that New Deal for Business. They recently have had increased engagement because of the IDBM report, which they are very grateful for. Something that I think this committee looked at, though, was how do we mainstream that? How do we make sure that these alternative business models are included in the New Deal for Business, and also going forward in things like Scottish enterprise thinking, Business Gateway, so that we can mainstream these alternative business models, given how important they are to the wellbeing economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Dr. Malik will have some thoughts on this as well. But I absolutely agree with that. And the mainstreaming point, rather than a sort of additional add-on. I wasn't here when the membership of the New Deal was determined or invited, so I'm not sure what the thinking was at that point as to who to involve and who not to involve. So my colleagues may have a greater thought on that. But I do think that mainstreaming that, and also rejecting the notion that I've reiterated a few times this morning, that the business community is homogenous, with the same view on anything and everything. It's just not the case. A lot of business owners, business workers of different kinds, they are citizens with lots of views on lots of different other policies that the government is engaged with. And we engage with them as citizens, irrespective of their role in relation to business, and take their views into account. So it is not a homogenous whole, and we need to have means for feedback and input and consultation, and then come to a conclusion that weighs all of that up, including from those alternative business models. I don't know, Dr. Malik, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. And just on the previous point about the legislation, and that goes through, I think Jamie's not here now, but I suppose another point that we were discussing, the skills earlier, and you have the skills bill in the Parliament. So that is, again, overall Parliament's responsibility to scrutinise at that time to say that it fits and it's fit for purpose, and challenge in that rather later looking backwards on it. Coming to your point, Lorna, in terms of the net zero circular economy targets, businesses are aware of it. Yes, the government has set a 2045 target ahead of everybody. And in principle, that is a thing people recognise. There is an education and awareness aspect of it, and then there is the target setting. Where the disconnect can happen is it is hard economically for businesses to run business, and operational costs are high. On top of that, if they need to take additional measures to change that, that is where the cost of doing additionality and changing to net zero practices become quite challenging. And that's what we are hearing from businesses. Every business that discusses, they are all aligned to wanting to do that change. But to reach that, there are additional requirements, and that's when they look for measures and supports and grants. And there are a number of those in implementation, but that doesn't satisfy everybody because of the limited pot. So, which is why how that journey from A to B will take place, it's a mutual agreement, understanding in terms of what government targets are, what grants and facilities are available, but where the businesses need to do work towards that. Because for businesses, it's decision-making an opportunity choice to say, I hire a new person, or I invest in a solar panel, or I invest in a heat pump. And that would be individualism, as well as in the innovative measures, because some of these requires adoption of innovative technologies. And that's where we come back to the productivity issue, because the major productivity is that our businesses are not spending as much in R&D as they should be. Coming back to your second point about the social enterprises or alternative business model, absolutely. We are, as I said, 99.3% of our businesses are SMEs. Similarly, with my Royal Society of Edinburgh fellowship point of view, I would say we produce a third sector report in which the contribution of third sector is widely recognized. But if we were to go to the membership point, we do have Muckle Media you heard from. They are a B Corp. That is an alternative business model that they are doing. So they are very much part of it, and they were representing independent business as well. We have business in the community BITS membership on the New Deal for Business. As we said, when we were looking for it, my key messaging to the officials was that I want a regional representation. I want the business which are single and large businesses, some trade membership, but also there has to be a geographic distribution and shape and sizes. We try as best to fit around the table in the St. Andrew's House what we could do, as long as we were making the basically voice of the society that we represent. We tried to do that. Naturally, there will be a lot of members, because I personally got approached by a number of people, and which is why we created this sort of generic address to say anybody who wants to feed, and there were 5 subgroups, which has a large number of membership. So there was an ample opportunity to include and feedback. Naturally, as we heard Tony, there are a number of businesses which either were involved in their businesses and didn't read the newspaper, and there needs to be that it's a two-way process. We need to reach out. But also the membership could be only few. But I take your point that it has to be a wider engagement, and that's what I have discussed with the officials, that maybe we needed to do a roadshow going on with the membership organization and getting in front of the people. But all that requires time. And as I said, nothing gets built, and which is why this culture change will take time, even to businesses to understand and seep in, because a lot of them still ask me, oh, are you still on that New Deal for Business thing? Because that's what people naturally are not doing a publication every day in the mainstream newspapers, which just happened in the beginning. But after that, it's head down, and now we are looking for the outcomes of that. The culture change will take place, but where the future is, I think that's the key point now, because the job is not done. It's the implementation, but we have to see that outcome achieved after that.
No, I appreciate and looking forward that there will be an opportunity to incorporate and help mainstream those businesses. If I can pick up on one of your points, Dr. Malik, I guess one of the things that I'm very keen to stress is there does seem to be in lots of people's minds this idea that moving to net zero is costly. And you represented that as well. And that, I think, can be a bit of a challenge. Things like the circular economy is about reducing waste, about making businesses, helping their bottom line. And it means reducing waste of energy, reducing waste of materials. Businesses might make the choice to fly less to conferences. That saves them money. So is there any work being done to work with businesses on how they can improve and make more money whilst reducing their waste and working on their route to net zero? Because if people think it's always going to cost them more money, when in fact just doing less is in many cases going to be the answer, then I feel like if that's the narrative, then that's going to be a barrier.
I would just say on that, Lorna, when I said that, that's what we are hearing from business. I'm representing their voice. That's not necessarily what I'm saying is my point of view in there. Because if I were to take on my own background, my master's is in biotechnology, and industrial biotechnology is all about how do we recycle, how do we green fuels, green chemicals. And if I were to include what Scottish Enterprise is working with businesses, we were having last board meeting at the Grangemouth. Now, it is in news for wrong reasons. It's shutting down. But there's an alternative plan. How do we create the Willow report? I think the First Minister is releasing that today, to say how do we regenerate that economy with the green bioeconomy? And that is all dependent on utilizing the waste. So Celtic Renewables is on site. which is actually producing the similar model, that they have mastered a technology where using the waste from our whisky and other sources that Scotland produces a lot of, and producing green chemicals which are utilized in the industry. Similarly, small businesses, with my industrial biotechnology focus, I would say, there are a number of large early stage innovative companies who are working in that businesses. Naturally, there is a process of innovation cycle when that innovation is adopted, and then there are small measures that businesses can put in practice. So a change and transformation is not easy. There has to be a cost involved to it. Like we know, transport, housing, everything changing and making it to net zero. But take your point in terms of that, some small steps can make large changes, and it's that awareness and willingness alongside the capital. It's three things need to come together for that transformation. But yes, the recognition and willingness to do a change comes first, which businesses are up for it, but they also look for some support and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, can I bring in Willie Coffey? Then I'm going to bring in Daniel online today.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you, Dr. Malik. Can I maybe ask you to reflect on what happens next? We've heard that the report will be finalised in April, and we've also heard from colleagues that even at this point, quite a lot of SMEs haven't heard of the new deal. I'm sure in your constituency and mine. So I'm wondering, how can we get them to feel part of and to participate in this going forward? So initially, just to ask you about that, where do we go next? Will there be a new deal 2 coming along down the track?
No, there won't be. The point of the New Deal for Business was systemic change, which is slightly different from policy outcomes, but was about processes. So the next stage is that those processes should work and be effective and lead to different outcomes for government in terms of what happens and what doesn't happen. So it's a systemic change. Engagement will continue. Extensive engagement, hopefully, will continue. There'll be better means by which different businesses can feed into processes. But that would be my objective. But I think it's a good question to hear from people on both sides of me. What happens next, Judith?
I'm more than happy to jump in on that point. So we have been looking, obviously we're very focused on getting to the finish line around New Deal for Business at this point in time and ensuring that we have completed effectively the outcomes that we set out to achieve. But beyond that, we are in the process of mapping how we make that change sustained and ensure that that is embedded in the work of government going forward. And that's not just the work of my team, but that's the work right across the piece. So we will be putting in place teams that will take forward work around the policy support and education. So promoting the tools and processes that we have developed, ensuring that there's an education piece across the whole of government so that officials are exposed to and understand how to work better with business and have support so that they can do that. So that's direct operational assistance. We'll be putting in place a number of scrutiny mechanisms to ensure that, and I suppose you can think about this as a bit of a carrot and stick. So you know, the policy support and education is the carrot. We're supporting our policy officials and other portfolio areas to work with business. Then we will be using the scrutiny mechanisms that we have, and particularly the Cabinet Subcommittee on Investment and the Economy, and also the Regulatory Review Group to look at, well, is that working, the scrutiny and assurance of that. We'll be doing work around regulatory improvement because we understand that regulations are a big issue for business. Different businesses will have different perspectives on that, but the key overarching thing that we hear from business around regulation is the need to recognise the cumulative impact and to ensure consistency. So tell us what you're doing, tell us when you're doing it, and don't keep changing that. And that kind of comes back to a point around the kind of visitor levy discussion that was going on earlier as well, that overarching feedback we got from businesses in that process was give us something that will operate consistently, including across local authority areas if that can be achieved. So we'll be doing work on regulatory improvement. And the other point that DFM has also mentioned is about that ongoing stakeholder engagement. So the other kind of main area of work that my division takes on, aside from the delivery of the New Deal for Business, is about managing DFM and other ministers' stakeholder engagement programmes and about communicating with businesses. So ensuring that we have mechanisms whereby we are able to effectively receive information in from business organisations, businesses themselves, and we gather that information, we ensure that it informs policy decisions, and we can also transmit information out about the changes and developments that we're putting in place in government for whatever purposes they are and how they impact on business. So those are the kind of 4 work strands that we will have going forward, and I think they will demonstrate that you know, whilst the New Deal for Business is no longer new, what we do have is a new normal here in terms of how we operate, and will consistently drive continuous improvement in that.
Okay. Dr Malik, how do we permeate the principles that are in the New Deal so that a wider number of small businesses in all our constituencies can participate in this? How do we do that?
Thank you, Willie. I think that is the key point. When we started this, I don't want to be bogged down into the names, what the name is, whether it's new, whether it's old or it's old. The idea is to be pro-business, pro-growth, pro-economy, and that was the ultimate. What we choose as our parameters in there is that processes, regulation, policy change, culture change, rather than looking directly for measures in terms of investment coming into it or creation of jobs, because that was ultimately anyway part of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which DFM in our previous role had implemented. So we were going to create this as a medium to do outcomes of those business success measures. And I think the work that has been done in the past 2 years, the proof will be in the pudding. So we have, like the DFLI report that is bare as part of this evidence today that you have, there is numbers increased, say 15% or 12% in sentiment and actions. That's one achievement we could say has, today the business feel more engaged. They feel that there is some more support for that. But the continuation of it, what is the future? Do we continue to hold that? Or what does it take to slip it down? Where can we fall? So Judith has outlined certain measures. How do we take account of that? And going back to my point of how do businesses feel to hold feet to the fire to say, has that been achieved? And how do we reflect on that? And what I'm hearing this entire session for last 45 minutes or so, and Michelle's just left, in terms of that oversight of fresh perspective, not hearing from the same old and same people, but involving those people who bring it from the, like I'm deeply embedded into the entrepreneurship community. I headed the investment for the last 3.5 years at the University of Strathclyde, where the businesses that were facing the challenges to secure investment or diverse group of students who are forming these, those are the businesses which are innovative and they have their challenges. And then the small businesses that are in sort of set up in the wider regions of Highland and Island Enterprise or the borders area. I think the success will be where we create, which initially was our purpose, to have Scotland as the most competitive business environment to be in. And I think that's what the ultimate success will look like. To be reaching there, it is not that whether it is structure state, but there has to be a strategic forum. The voices don't get lost. The intelligence and the feedback from the community and having that regular engagement and interaction, and then measuring those success at the end of it would be the successful outcome in my eyes.
Yeah, finally, Katie, are you confident that it's a genuine two-way relationship? I mean, you spoke quite positively about businesses' asks being reflected back in policy development. Are you quite confident that that will develop and grow, and we'll see more of that as a result of this engagement process through New Deal?
Hopefully, yes. That is the aim, that is the ambition. I think that there are particular flashpoints where that is tested in terms of new policies and so on. But what we have tried to do for the last budget and programme for government too is to give some breathing space where there hasn't actually been any surprises or anything that's caught them out or and so on. So there is something about this being a particularly tumultuous time, and I think that giving business some space to be able to respond to those challenges is a good thing for government to do.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If I would
Dr. Malik?
add to that is that the door has been opened for that dialogue between the business and the government. The criteria and the process have been set. But like any relationship, it requires constant work. Otherwise, it fades away. Similarly, in this case, we cannot sit on our laurels to say we've done this, been there. This will require constant engagement, and that would be the ultimate success. So which is why using the parameters and the pathway, continuously working with businesses, listening to them, and we set out at the beginning, not everybody will be satisfied because the asks are different, and not every ask can be fulfilled because the government has to look within its parameters. The businesses ask, they would want the best that is suited for business. But it is that compromise which is agreeing on each other, and sometimes not even agreeing on it, but knowing what are each other's boundaries and parameters are there and where they may or may not agree. I think that would be the key, to work on that and keep listening for that.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Willie, can I bring in Daniel Johnson?
Thank you, Convener, and apologies to everyone witnessing the session for having to turn my camera on. I hope it's not too off-putting. But look, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things. I mean, I don't think I'm paraphrasing unfairly, given that, Kate Forbes, you said that this is not job done. This is, in a sense, moving on to the next stage. And what I have been reflecting on as I've been listening to the evidence is that there's been a lot of focus on dialogue, a lot of focus on communication. There's been discussion of processes, but what I haven't necessarily heard is about actually how government is going to make the environment better for business overall. And indeed, I just wonder if you could unpack a statement you made earlier on in the evidence, which I thought was quite interesting, where you were reflecting on that actually, getting this right will mean actually that agencies like Marine Scotland and SEPA actually having kind of business growth at the heart of how they understand what they need to do. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more, because clearly we need agencies like Marine Scotland to be able to deliver the throughput of decision-making if we're going to roll out things like offshore wind. I just wondered if you could just maybe expand upon that remark a little bit more.
Absolutely. So here's an example. Doubling the resource in the Energy Consents Unit wasn't necessarily, unless my colleagues are going to correct me, wasn't necessarily considered a top priority for the New Deal for Business. But it has emerged as one of the top requests by developers in a sector which is forecast to deliver high growth to the Scottish economy. The point of the New Deal for Business was not to capture all of the policy asks in one place and then track whether or not we could deliver on them. The point of the New Deal for Business was to deliver systemic change in the processes and the tests for any policy development at all. So actually being able to double the resource in the Energy Consents Unit and target a sub-12-month turnaround time for planning applications is an example of how that has been achieved by an area of government that wouldn't necessarily see themselves as being in the business of economic development, would see themselves in the business of planning, regulation, and so on. So that is what I meant. And I think that the test of the New Deal for Business will be if that culture change continues. I personally think, and maybe I would just claim this credit, but in the last 6 months it's dramatically been embedded in a number of different organisations. And for example, on the investment stuff I am doing, for the first time we have a pipeline of all the private sector-led and the public sector-led opportunities for growth and requirements for investment, which we've not had before. So you look like you're about to come in with a second question.
Well, no, and that's an important point. And Angus McPherson was clear in his report that government needed to stop treating those things as wish lists and have a much more serious list of investable opportunities. But I wonder if that is actually not part of the same problem, and that it's good that you have that. But the real issue is actually making sure that all your processes that might stand in the way of those investments actually are aligned to objectives? Because you just said that the resource level has had to be put in to achieve a 12-month decision-making. Now, my understanding was that was the policy before that resource went in. So does that not indicate that actually there's not been an alignment of all government processes towards its broader business and economic objectives?
I think it's about more than that. I think that at any point we are grappling economically with different challenges, some of them unexpected, some of them expected but happening more quickly. So let's take the same example. National Strategy, published a couple of years ago, explicitly said that targeting new emerging markets was a big opportunity for the government, and it explicitly talked about the energy transition. Now, we then had ScotWind, where the leasing round massively exceeded our original target, and the government agreed to that massive increase because it was such a huge opportunity. And so, government, therefore, and its agencies have to respond to what we were anticipating, but at a much higher volume. And that is where doubling the resource and so on comes in. You again look like you're about to come into with another question. I don't want to cut across you.
You should ignore me until you're finished.
So the point is we have to be flexible. And flexibility is one of the things that perhaps hasn't been raised in this committee session so far. But we have to be flexible. The processes need to be able to adapt and flex in response to new issues. We weren't anticipating an increase in ENICs to be of such a massive issue, and businesses are scrambling to respond. Agriculture didn't expect various different changes to come through, and they are scrambling to respond. And beyond our shores, we may not have expected 2 years ago or 3 years ago, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that would mean. My point is our processes need to be flexible enough to respond, which is why the New Deal for Business wasn't about specific policies, it was about processes.
Forgive me, the flexibility point is really important because obviously business is having to constantly reflect the changing world, and you're quite correct. You know, there's a number of external factors that, 12, 18 months ago we might not have predicted. But actually, I wonder if the consenting point is actually a different one. Now, and it's important to pull it out because I think it's actually one that is absolutely fundamental to business. It's about investment decisions, but it's also one that actually touches on other policy areas and is about explicit policy. Now, my point being this, is that if you can't embed government processes that align to what are very explicitly stated economic objectives of the government, ones which are not just sort of a sideshow but have been front and centre of dialogue, does that not highlight a little bit of a problem around the government's ability to map out those objectives against the processes which have touch points on the decision making? And further to that, if we can't get it right for things like installation of offshore wind, which is very high profile, what hope do we have for sort of more mundane day-to-day economic objectives, like growing SMEs or helping our high streets?
So I guess my confusion about the question is the example I've given you demonstrates where we have done it well. So recognising the volume of consenting applications, we doubled the resource. So we're not still talking here about the fact that that resource needs to still be doubled. I'm here with a completed action that it's been doubled.
Decisions within your own stated timeframes. So that's
you were cut off at the beginning.
That you hadn't got it right, isn't it?
No, not at all, because we have responded. So we have responded to that increase, and by and large, not everybody, but by and large, consenting is no longer identified as the biggest concern. What came through our Monday conference, where I was delighted to sit alongside Michael Shanks on offshore wind, is that their biggest concern right now is the uncertainty around CFD, contract for difference, allocations, and grid connections being too far in the future. So all of us know there's a need to respond, but actually we're very proud of having doubled the resource in the consenting unit without much fanfare. We've just done it, and that shows a flexibility of response. The other points around High Street are a little bit more challenging because there are so many different factors having an impact on that. Some of them are out with our control. So, for example, the rapid rise in online shopping, for example, that has happened, has had an impact on our high streets, the impact of COVID. So where we can respond is rethinking high streets and what support goes in to supporting our high streets. But I think it is a little bit more complicated. But I am at risk of continually hogging this. So I don't know, Dr. Malik, if you've got any ideas to share.
Thank you. I think I'll leave the government issues to DFM. I'll take the broader issues of attracting investment and what we could do. Suppose when we started this from the New Deal for Business, overall purpose was to as a refresh and reset. And I know the pro-business policy is hot across all over Scotland and UK, and it's on the agenda of most citizens at the moment to talking about whether the political spectrum or the business. So from that point of view, the key here is how do we make Scotland most competitive business environment that the other businesses wish to come here, do business with Scottish businesses, invest in Scotland, and to do that, understanding what our assets are. And you highlighted offshore wind and energy, naturally transition into the renewable energy aspect of it. I would say that that is where we have the opportunity, and we are. What is needed here is working. One example, I would say, in which the Scottish Development International, the Scottish Government has been successful, is bringing Sumitomo's investment in here. But what is required is the creation of a supply chain issues around that. Because if there isn't a successful supply chain, and alongside I will add another skills agenda, then those larger scale investment opportunities, which larger investors look to do. So the ask here for Scotland is overall to unite and think of what are those big opportunities where we can took together and talk about Scotland PLC and offer that attractive. And which is why, and the second aspect I would say in this from Scotland point of view with my other interest in Royal Society I mentioned, is this Mansion House Compact that we are talking about. How do we ensure that the pension houses which have signed up and committed to do that 5% of their overall funding into innovation businesses, that comes to Scotland. That doesn't remain south of the border or north of the border. It comes to Scotland. And for that, we need, and DFM has pointed out she's working, but we have had this discussion in the past that we need to ensure a different level, because those innovation businesses are the ones which are deep tech businesses, spin-outs, which are scaling, and they need to be invested in rather than the mid-market property businesses. So I think that would be the key focus that I would be looking to some engagement on.
I couldn't agree more about the pension point, both in terms of attracting pension funds from elsewhere in the UK to invest here, but also making sure that our pension funds are taking sort of similar decisions. But look, just briefly on I can't resist. I would just say I think consenting and planning is still a concern, even if it has got better. I would gently say to the First Minister, and I was slightly amused. I'm somewhat familiar with the challenges of online as a former retailer, but I think it just highlights the point is that I think where you've got greater complexity, I think the touch points and thinking them through become ever more important. and was really only the point I was trying to make. It would be remiss of me to have the Deputy First Minister in front of the committee and for not to raise non-domestic rates. And I would just remind the committee of my register of interest as director and owner of a business with retail interests. But you mentioned there had been progress. I would just wonder if the Deputy First Minister could actually just outline what her view was of what that progress looks like. I don't think the evidence that we'd heard directly from some of those people involved necessarily was as positive as that. And she will know that, and I've shared this with her in private as well, is I think there are some deep dysfunctions with the way non-domestic rates, not least of which just the balance between different types of businesses. With consumer-facing businesses, I think, being taxed disproportionately in comparison to other sectors. So I was just wondering if she could just outline what she sees that progress and what outcomes business can expect from those conversations.
I confess to being absolutely surprised that it's taken till 11:23 for anybody to raise non-domestic rates, and commend Daniel Johnson for being the first to do so. Can I just say that there's obviously a subgroup on non-domestic rates, and I think the subgroup on non-domestic rates has valued the opportunity to engage in a deeper way on a lot of these issues and consider how the non-domestic rate system can best support business growth. And whilst we've obviously made the decision on the New Deal for Business coming to its natural conclusion, the subgroup on non-domestic rates will continue to meet going forward. So hopefully it will continue to be a forum. It has delivered changes. So, for example, one that may feel quite minor, but the deadline for lodging proposals on non-domestic rates valuations was extended as a result of feedback on concerns. And there has been dialogue and engagement that hadn't happened previously through the non-domestic rates subgroup on non-domestic rates itself. There's been short life task teams to consider very specific issues that is very much getting into the weeds, including property improvement, promotion of reliefs, valuation transparency, information flows, and the impact of reliefs itself. So again, it's allowed for really in-depth conversations that wouldn't normally happen at the level that we would normally have around just generalising the changes that need to happen around non-domestic rates. On other specific changes, Daniel Johnson and I have had conversations. I remain very open and interested in changing the methodology for hospitality businesses. The key is finding consensus on what that change should be. And I know also, which I've shared with him, the proposed changes that the UK government are introducing on non-domestic rates, where larger businesses will indefinitely supplement basically the reliefs that are provided to smaller businesses, which we can't replicate. So there is a particular urgency in looking at what the alternative will be in Scotland. But on methodology itself, there remains an outstanding question on what could replace the methodology currently, and that is dependent on data. Judith, do you have anything to add on the specifics of any of that? And if not, don't worry.
Not specifically my area, DFM.
That's fine.
Actually, I really wouldn't want to subject the committee to the detail of this at all, but I was just wondering if there was detail around particularly valuation transparency, that I would be very interested in that, because I think that is actually where the devil in the detail is for a lot of businesses, because as you're actually there isn't great transparency or clarity on methodology, and I have looked at how individual premises have actually had their calculations done, and it would probably be quite eye-opening for some people. So I'd be quite interested to look at that, the detail of what is being discussed in terms of the valuation transparency, so that people have greater clarity as to actually how rateable values are arrived at, because I'm not convinced that it's as consistent, as robust as it could be.
One of the areas where I would like to see greater progress, and I imagine Daniel Johnson would agree with me, is on the complexity of the technology landscape for non-domestic rate systems in local authorities. And this is a similar point to the one that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson raised earlier in relation to the tourism levy, where we can recognise some of the points that are being raised, but it does need to be initiated by local authorities themselves if there is to be any fundamental changes to the technology. So the delivery of any changes to the digital systems and, for example, the level of information that you can access through the digital systems needs a joint view from all councils. So I have engaged previously with Revenue Scotland, who have an appetite to help support councils with a far more streamlined approach to non-domestic rates. We have multiple different systems operating. And if there was consensus amongst local authorities to improve that technology, I think there would be a willingness from us to work with them. But I do need to emphasise here that whilst it's easy to ask of government for a number of changes, on a local tax, it does need to be initiated by local government. And Daniel Johnson's looking sceptically at me.
Yeah, no, look, it's a really good point. But the problem with that is, and I think we're in danger of taking the committee down a rabbit hole that probably none of the rest of them want to go down. But because of the way that because local authorities collect non-domestic rates, but then it is actually redistributed from the centre, they're not incentivised to do that. And I agree that we'd need them to want to do it, but actually, and this is a much longer conversation, which is why I suggest that we maybe park it for now. But you are right. That would be a big benefit, and you're right, it would need to be led by local authorities. But because of the way that the system works, they're probably not incentivised to want to do that.
I disagree fundamentally with this point about their incentivisation. I think local authorities are incentivised on this point, and I think that there is an extensive focus on the Scottish Government on what we are or aren't doing to incentivise economic prosperity and growth. But actually, a lot of levers lie with local government, and I don't always think there is the same level of scrutiny. So in the consultation process for the visitor levy, for example, it is one of the first examples where a local authority does need to consult extensively with local businesses in terms of implementing a new economic intervention. And whilst it might be easy to keep coming back to the root, I would invite all of us to work with our local government too, because often on planning, on local taxation, on local consultation, the levers do lie with local government. And to keep coming back to central government undermines their responsibility and duty to do that.
I both completely agree and completely disagree. I agree with the point. The fundamental point here is actually most are a very significant number of the microeconomic levers that shape the economy absolutely lie with local authorities. Most profoundly planning, because through the planning system that you control land use. But I just would question whether or not the system is wired up correctly so that actually local authorities are incentivised to actually understand those impacts and align them to economic growth. But I think it's a really interesting point, and one that I think I fundamentally agree with the fundamental point that we need to work more closely with local authorities to ensure that the growth agenda is delivered, because they are in control of so many of those levers, whether that's planning, transport, education. These are really fundamental economic levers, and I think we need to have a lot more focus on how we deploy them. So I'd agree with that. And basically, I guess I'm also saying is that I think we've probably gone off on those tangents enough. But I think look forward to discussing them further in the future.
I think I'll hold that there. To be fair, Daniel Johnson was letting you off the hook there, Cabinet Secretary, but you incited him back in there with your responses. So, but I'm going to halt the debate there because it is an important issue, and I'll refrain from talking about hospitality and the way we assess that. But Kevin Stewart has said he wants a brief supplementary. I'm nervous about this.
I don't think you need to be. I think one of the frustrating things, and it kind of came out in terms of Daniel Johnson's contribution, is the fact that local authorities have a lot of powers which they don't use. They have flexibilities which they don't use. They can exempt business from various things which they don't do. How are you going to get local government on board to follow the practices of the New Deal for business and actually get things moving in certain places?
Well, Kevin, this is good bookends, because I think I said to you in the first question you asked that the key for New Deal for business is the extent to which it filters through and down to other organisations. And with things like local taxation, there is a duty in law on local government to engage and consult well with local businesses. So I think I'm going to be quite bold in saying it is therefore the lazy option to keep coming back to government and say the problem is with what we have or haven't done on the legislation, when there is quite extensive flexibilities in the legislation and there is a new responsibility on local government, which they are incentivised to do well, to engage well on these points. So part of the answer is that when there is a new opportunity and responsibility on local government, local citizens should hold the relevant and appropriate government responsible for what they do. And in that case, it is local authorities. The same goes for planning, and the same goes for local transport decisions.
Kevin, can I just a couple of very final quick-fire questions on some of the recommendations? So the regulation subgroup recommended an overhaul of business regular impact assessments. So have BRIAs been revisited to assess the accuracy of the process and address those unintended consequences which was raised? Has that happened as a result of that?
Absolutely,
and
that's happened. So we now have a new template for BRIAs, and we are looking at the governance associated with that, so that BRIAs have to go through a series of gateways that sign those off. But yes, absolutely, we have made those changes. Okay, and on the issue of regulation, is there now a formal process for identifying and removing regulations that are no longer required? Is there a process put in place to do that? Okay, so on this point, the focus that we have had in regulation has been on the pipeline of new regulations. So we've been looking at the regulations that are in genesis and that are coming down the pipe, potentially impacting business. And that has been the focus of the Regulatory Review Group to date. That's been an explicit choice that was made by the New Deal for Business Group, who recognised that was a much more long-term objective, which would take longer to achieve. The context around removing legislation is obviously something, removing regulations rather, is obviously something that is rising to prominence, particularly at the UK government with the publication of their plan for action earlier this week. And it's something that we will look at from here on in as part of that ongoing work around regulation. So we've done the first part, we're working on the second part, I think is the answer to that. Okay, and just on that point, final question, is there now a clear published and continuously updated list of regulations in development that shows the cumulative impact of forthcoming regulations? So again, we produced that as a one-off exercise in advance of the programme for government. That was the document that I talked about as discussing with the executive team and directors general. We haven't yet got a process for keeping that up to date. Because of the scope and scale of regulation that occurs across the piece, and if you look at the work that's being done in the UK government, there is no formal definition of a regulation, but it's definitely a work in progress to begin to produce that on a more regular basis. Because obviously that cumulative impact is something that cumulative impact is absolutely recognised as something that's imperative, and I think the Cabinet Subcommittee and that helicopter view that it can take across policy decisions across different portfolio is going to be the key to unlocking that assessment of cumulative impact and ensuring that that's taken into account.
Okay, I'm sure everyone will be pleased to know that brings us to the end of what has been, I think, a very helpful evidence session as part of our work on the New Deal for Business. So thank you so much indeed to our panel, Deputy First Minister Dr Malik and Judith Young, for joining us today and giving us all your evidence and feedback. And I'll suspend this meeting and move into private session.